I'm Wendy from Shiny Happy World, and this is the turkey. He is the newest pattern in the Funny Faces Quilt Block of the Month Club. And when I say he's the current pattern, it is November 15th, 2020. So he is going to be in a pattern that's exclusive to Funny Faces Club members from now through December 15th of 2020, at which point we will have a new pattern. After that, probably sometime early in January, you'll be able to find him in the shop at Shiny Happy World. So he is a single pattern, just a single block pattern for the club, but he would go really well with the Woodland Critters quilt pattern. So if you already have the Woodland Critters quilt pattern, this is made to the same block dimensions, so you can just add this pattern right to all of the other blocks and have a little extra variety in your quilt. So I'm going to show you how to make him in the next batch of videos here. But first I just want to explain very quickly, because my quilt as you go method is a little bit different from what most people do. So I'm just going to give you the nutshell version here. So when I do quilt as you go, the first thing, let's pretend like the applique isn't on here. The first thing I do is layer my background block with a square of batting, and you use cotton batting for it, and do all of the quilting. So I quilt the entire block before I add any applique. And you can see that if you look over on the back of them, you can see that these quilt lines continue underneath where the turkey is. So after I do my quilting, press the block flat, let it cool, and then I layer all my applique, and I do applique with fusible adhesive. So that's what you're going to see in this video. You can use other applique methods, but the one that I use is fusible adhesive. I get that all fused in place, and then I do all of the outline stitching. Then I trim the block down to size. You can see there's a little bit of extra seam allowance and a little bit of extra batting down here. All of this is going to be trimmed down so that he is kind of popping into the block as if it's a picture, close-up photo of him. Trim the blocks down to size. Then I sew all the blocks together and press those seams open. There's a little bulk. Cotton batting is pretty thin, but there's still a little bit of bulk. So you want to press those seams open. Then I add the backing and do just a little bit of quilting just in the ditch all the way around all of the blocks. So what this allows me to do is do fairly elaborate quilting inside the blocks, and also all of this outline stitching. I can be spinning and twirling this block out around inside in the size of my sewing machine without worrying about the whole heavy mass of the entire quilt. The only time I'm doing the entire quilt is when I'm doing that final stitching, and that is 10 inches apart, and it's just straight lines. And if you're gonna do machine quilting on a standard sewing machine with a full-size quilt, that's the easiest to do. And I can do a nap size quilt, that's the size that I like to use on the couch, in about a half an hour. So I can handle wrestling the entire mass of the quilt through my machine for a half an hour. So I just wanted to show you one other color variation before we get into the how-to. Everybody always asks about the fabric, and a lot of times I forget to mention what it is. So in this case, all of the colors that I used in the turkey, except for his wattle and snood, all of these are from the Warm Neutrals fabric bundle. There is a dark orange in there that I could have used for his wattle and snood, but really in reality they are very, very bright red. So I pulled the dark red out of the Rainbow Brights fabric bundle, and the background block is from the Frosty Pastels bundle, or the Rainbow Sherbet fabric bundle. And I've got him in another color too, just to show you a different, this was also very natural colors. So in this one, these are the the Warm Neutrals Batiks fabric bundle. So I used batiks for all of the applique in this one. The snood and wattle are from the Rainbow Bright Batiks, and the background block is from the Box of Crayons bundle, which I call my grown-up rainbow. It's just rainbow colors, but a little bit toned down. So those are two options. And on this one, you can actually see, this is a good example to show the kind of very curvy quilting that is very, very easy to do because I'm only quilting one block at a time. I'm not sure you can see it really well there, but on the back of this, you can see very clearly I've got these kind of wonky, wavy lines, wavy stripes in there. So that's super, super easy to do when I'm just doing a single block in there. That would be really, really rough to try and do that kind of quilting if I had the entire quilt all sewn together. So that is the introduction to the turkey pattern and a quick nutshell view of overview of how I do quilt as you go. Now we're going to get into the specifics of this particular pattern. Okay, the first thing you're going to want to do is trace or print your pattern onto the paper-backed fusible adhesive. I like to print mine because I'm lazy and I don't like to trace, and this is the brand I use. I use Heat and Bond, and I use the lightweight for all of my quilts. I really like that, and it's the one with the purple packaging. You can also get it by the bolt or by the yard and trace it, but I like to print it. So the turkey is a big guy, so he's going to be printed out on, it's going to take 2 sheets of the adhesive to print all of the parts for this guy. After you get it transferred onto the paper side of the paper-backed fusible adhesive, you're going to roughly cut those pieces out and then fuse them to the back side of your fabric. And when I say roughly cut out, I mean don't cut it right on the lines. You're going to cut it a little bit outside all of the solid lines on each pattern piece. And then you're going to fuse it to the back side of the fabric. So this guy's got a lot of pieces, and I'm just going to give you a quick rundown here of what we have. We've got a turkey beak. This is the big tail feathers piece on the back. His head. We have a wattle and a snood. A little eye. And then there are a couple of waves of feathers. So there's more turkey feathers, a turkey breast, and even more turkey feathers. So there's a lot of different kind of, it's like a layered view in the mountains. You've got a layered view of the feathers as you go up the turkey's body. So the next step is going to be clean cut, and we'll do that in the next segment. Okay, the next step after you get everything rough cut and fused down is to do what I call a clean cut. And that is cutting everything out on the solid lines. For now, ignore all of the dotted lines. Those are just placement markings, and we'll talk about them in a second. But the reason that you do a rough cut first, it seems like you're kind of doubling the work, but it's actually really important. If you do the rough cut first, then fuse it, and then cut the clean cut, what you do is make sure that your adhesive is going all the way to the very, very edge of each cut piece, and it's covering every single thread. Because right now on the full piece, the adhesive is going past that cut edge. So by cutting it after you fuse it down, you get adhesive covering every single bit of that. So I've got all of my pieces clean cut, and we're going to move on. I'm going to talk about those placement markings. Okay, before we peel off the paper backing, we want to transfer all of these placement lines from the paper to the front of your pieces. And I use a couple of different tools for that. And I'm going to walk you through which tools I use when. And we're going to use this turkey head for one quick example, and then I'll move to something that we'll be able to see it a little bit better. So this turkey is a fairly complicated pattern with a lot of pieces. So you'll see that there are a lot of these placement lines on the pattern. Don't worry about it. They'll make sense as you're assembling the pieces. So the first tool that I use is a Sharpie permanent pen. I use this to mark any eyes or lines like smile lines and things like that. On this turkey pattern, there's only one piece that's a black applique piece, and that is the eye. So I'll mark that with the black pen. First of all, the eye is, if you only mark a couple of pieces, the eye is the most important one to mark because that's when you really want to make sure you get in the right place. And it doesn't matter that you're using a black pen because you're going to put a black applique piece over it, so you don't have to worry about those lines showing through it all, through the front of your applique. So for anything that's going to be covered with a black applique piece, in this case just the eye, I use a Sharpie. For everything else, I use two different options. I either use a white chalk marker or I use just a plain old pencil, nothing fancy. I just like a black Ticonderoga pencil. Whenever possible, I'll use the chalk. And the chalk lines here are pretty faint, so I'm going to grab a different piece where the fabric is a very dark color, and that is this turkey breast. And you can see there are all of these dotted lines on the piece. hold this up with fabric side facing you in a window, and even on a dark fabric like this, you can see the lines through the front of the fabric and just trace over them with either a chalk or a pencil, depending on the darkness of the fabric that you're using. You just need a line that's going to show up well enough for you to be able to see it for the placement. So for some of these, I can see them very clearly. I'm not sure that they read really well on the camera, but there's enough that do read that you'll see when we do the assembly how that works. So the reason that you have to use an erasable pencil is that sometimes these don't completely get overlapped when you're overlapping pieces, and you want to be able to erase those lines. And for that, I just use a simple white plastic artist eraser. These are very, very inexpensive, and they erase with leaving no residue. I love the Ticonderoga pencils, but they have a black eraser, and that will sometimes leave just a very faint smudgy line, and usually if you're using the pencil, it's because it's a very light fabric. So you want to make sure not to have that line visible afterwards, and you can erase it very cleanly with just a plain white eraser. So I've transferred all of the placement lines to the front of the pieces, and now I can peel off the paper backings, which means I can assemble the final quilt block. So that's what's next. Okay, now we're ready to start layering these pieces down, and you're going to see all these placement lines in action. So we're going to start with the great big turkey tail piece. And this has a straight edge over here on the side, and that's going to line up with the raw edge at the edge of your block. And here I've got some selvage I left on, so I'm just lining this up with the edge of my selvage. I know I'm going to trim that away, and then this is going to be buried in the seam allowance. So he's going to be kind of popping into the frame here. I don't know yet how far up or down. That's going to be adjusted once I get these other pieces in. So for now, we're just going to get that one there. Then we've got the next layer of turkey feathers, and this actually has a little hard corner piece, and that's what's going to go down in the corner of the block. So I'm going to overlap this, and you can see the line on the brown turkey feather tells me how far it overlaps, and this one shows me where on this piece it overlaps. And on this one I also have that straight line as a guide. But you can see as you start getting the pieces lined up, all of the other lines will line up. So what looks kind of like gibberish at first is going to make a lot of sense once you start layering the pieces together. So I've slid this down so that I've got these two straight edges that we're establishing are lining up with the raw edges, the raw edge and the selvage edge at this side of the block. All right, so I've got those guys positioned. And next, I'm going to do the next layer of turkey feathers. And this also has a little bit of a straight edge, and that's coming up from the bottom of the block. So I'm lining that straight edge up there, and all of these pieces, and now you can see that my head is starting to take shape here. I'm going to pull this out just a little bit. Again, just kind of making all of those lines at least roughly connect. I'm not super careful with how I do the tracings on the front. It's really just a guide. So if your lines jog a little bit like that, it just means that I wasn't very careful in how I traced it. So now we're going to put the turkey breast on there, and that also, this straight edge gets lined up with the raw edge at the bottom of the block. All right, now we can start layering in some of the head pieces, and there's a lot in there. So I'm going to start out with the beak. I've got a placement line here that shows me roughly where that's going to go. If I can, I like to set it down in a way that covers up my lines there, and that way that's just some lines I don't have to bother erasing. Now we've got the head, so we know that's going to come up here. And there we go, those lines are giving us a nice indication. And the head is going to overlap that beak a little bit. Now I'm going to go ahead and put the wattle in. And I've got a nice clear line showing where that goes. And that is overlapping the top of the bottom of the head. You can see that there. And then I've got, this is called a snood, this weird waddle-ish kind of piece that hangs down off the turkey's head. It took me a second to figure out which way this goes, but I have my lines here, so that little chunk shows me where it overlaps the beak. And this point up here, the kind of this teardrop top, lines up with the top of the head. And then this is a thing that kind of grows out of their forehead and hangs down over the side of their beak. It's very, very odd looking. And last but not least, I've got a tiny little eye. And if you don't want to stitch around such a small piece, you can always use fabric paints or something like that. I've got a link to a blog post that has all kinds of different options for the eyes. So there you go. I'm going to get all of that. I'm going to take this over to the ironing board, double check I've got made everything exactly where I want it, because once I fuse it down, there's no undoing it. And then I'm going to fuse it all into place, erase all of my guidelines, and then I'm going to take it to the sewing machine and do some outline stitching, and then I'll bring it back and show it to you and talk you through the path that I took for outlining, since this is a fairly complicated bird. Okay, here he is all finished, and I'm just going to take you through the path that I do to do the outline stitching. I like to plan it out ahead of time so I don't have to stop and tie knots and restart as very often. So I try and keep that to a minimum. So I start with the eye. There's not much you can do about it. Just stitch outline once around the eye, tie a knot, and you're done. I only do one round of stitching on the eye because it's black stitching on a black background and you can't see it anyway. So it's just there to hold it so that this can go through the washer and dryer if you make it into a full quilt. So after that, I do 3 rounds of stitching everywhere else, and I don't try and line those lines up exactly on top of each other because I want it to have kind of a sketchbook look to it. So I start down here in his waddle, and I started right below, about 1/4 of an inch below where it turns into the gray of his head. And I went around here once, twice, 3 times, and then I continue past where I started, and now I'm going to do the top of the head and continue onto the snood and go down here once around that teardrop shape up to the top. That's once around the snood. Now on the second time around, I'm going to pick up some extra bits. So I go down past the base of the beak here, and then I do the beak once, twice, 3 times. And then I go again over the beak, the base of the beak here. You can't tell the difference between 4 rows of stitching and 3. So this is just an easy little shortcut to keep from tying a knot. I keep going down here, and now I'm going to pick up this bit of his feathers. And I went 1, 2, 3, and then 4 to get back up to where I started. So again, a little double stitching. Continue on the snood, and now I'm going to pick up this little bit of his neck. 1, 2, 3, and then back up with 4. Continue around the snood, and now a 3rd trip around the snood. 1, just easy, and continue on up over the head. Now we're doing the 2nd trip around the head, and then back up the 3rd trip, tie off at the top where it joins the snood. So that is all of that I was able to do with just 1 knot. Now I pick up, I'm going to do all the rest. So I'm going to pick up down here at his shoulders, pick up right at the waddle, and go 1, 2, 3, carry a little bit here, just 1 little row of stitching to get me over to here. 1, 2, 3, and now I do a little extra stitching to travel up here, and now I do this top row. 1, 2, 3, and then I carried up here, just did some stitching all the way up here, and then I went around here once, twice, 3 times, and then down here I went up to where the waddle joint starts, and then I went 1, 2, 3, and tied my 3rd knot and got him all outlined. So that is the turkey pattern, all of the steps to take you through that. We'll have the newest pattern in the Funny Faces Quilt Block of the Month Club in December, but for now, this turkey is our guy. I'll see you next month.